Hello? Hello? Hi, everybody. I would like to welcome you all to this evening's lecture. My name is Elaine Yonel, and I am the chair of the mathematics department here at Stanford. This lecture is one in a series of public lectures that is organized by the Stanford Mathematics Department and is sponsored by Stanford Mathematical Research Center and by the Friends of Stanford Mathematics. And in fact, if you'd like to be notified by future events, if you would like to be notified about future events like this, and you are not on our mailing list, please send me an email at chair@math.stanford.edu. This evening, we are very fortunate to have as our speaker Professor Ingrid Daubechies. Before we begin, I would like to tell you a couple of things about our speaker. So Professor Ingrid Daubechies was born in Belgium and studied physics at the WWII University in Brussels, where she first got a bachelor's in science degree in 1975, followed by a PhD in physics in 1980, and then she became a research professor in their Department of Theoretical Physics until 1987. In 1987, she moved to the United States as a researcher at the Mathematical Research Center at AT&T Bell Labs, and also a professor of mathematics at Rutgers University. In 1993, Professor Ingrid Daubechies joined the math department at Princeton University, becoming the first woman professor of mathematics at Princeton. In 2010, she was elected the president of the International Mathematical Union, again, the first woman to hold this position. In 2011, she moved to Duke University, where she is now the James B. Duke Professor of Mathematics, Electrical Engineering, and Computer Engineering. Early on, at the beginning of her career at AT&T Bell Labs, Professor Daubechies became a leading authority on wavelet theory, constructing a class of wavelets that is now widely used in image compression. Her work is fundamental to JPEG image compression and other signal processing. Ingrid also made major contributions to time frequency analysis and inverse problems in a wide range of settings, including in functional MRI, geophysics, paleontology, and the history and conservation of art. A leading applied mathematician, Professor Daubechies is a member of National Academy of Sciences, a MacArthur Fellow, and a Fellow of the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers. She won many prestigious awards. Let me just name a few of them. The Steele Prize for Mathematical Exposition in 1994 for her book, 10 Lectures on Wavelets. The Golden Jubilee Award for Technological Innovation from IEEE Information Theory Society in 1998. The National Academy of Sciences Award in Mathematics in 2000, the Guggenheim Fellowship in 2010, the IEEE Kilby Signal Processing Medal in 2011, the Steele Prize for Seminal Contribution to Research in 2011, the Benjamin Franklin Medal in Electrical Engineering in 2011, the Nemers Prize in Mathematics in 2012, and the BBVA Foundation Frontiers of Knowledge and Culture Award in Basic Sciences, shared with David Mumford in 2013. In addition to her research contributions, Professor Daubechies is also a great mentor and an ambassador of mathematics, actively involved in stimulating mathematics, science, and technology worldwide, including in developing countries, and contributing to far-reaching initiatives aimed at fostering a richer environment for learning and research for mathematicians and scientists everywhere. And I would be remiss if I would not also mention that Ingrid has been a fantastic role model for many women in mathematics, including myself, a true trailblazer and an inspiration for us all. So we are very fortunate this evening and delighted to have Ingrid with us tonight. The title of her lecture is Mathematics, Art, Historians, and Conservators. Tonight, Ingrid will take us on a tour showing how mathematical algorithms have benefited the work of art historians and art conservators, from helping piece together thousands of fragments of a famous fresco destroyed during World War II, to virtually removing artifacts in preparation for a restoration campaign, or revealing details of a painting hidden underneath a visible one. So please join me in welcoming Professor Ingrid Daubechies tonight.
Well, thank you very much, Eleni. So I want to tell you a little bit about how mathematicians and including myself are helping art conservation and art history. And I have a little pun in the title. I want to show that it goes both ways. Mathematicians benefit and the art historians benefit. So in the second half of the presentation, I'll talk about my own work, and in particular work in collaboration with North Carolina Museum of Art. But let me tell you a few other projects that are done by other people. The first one is by Massimo Fornazier, who actually who was my postdoc for a while and who's now a professor at the Technical University in München. But the work I'm going to talk about he did before he even worked with me as a graduate student. So in the Eremitani Church in Padua is world-renowned for a fantastic frescoes. Unfortunately, at the end of the war, the church was bombed by mistake, and it destroyed frescoes, fantastic frescoes by Mantegna and by others. And here you see a reconstruction of what these frescoes looked like in the church. I mean, this is a virtual thing. Actually, the only one, a fresco that is in color here, is the only one that survived the bombing. Because ironically, it had been removed because it was in bad condition. It had some water damage. The others were in perfect condition. And so the one that was damaged was in a lab being restored. And so it didn't get destroyed together with the church. But all the rest was reduced to rubble of this nature, and many boxes of it. And people had been trying, I mean, they had been stored in Rome, and every so often people opened the boxes and said, can we do something, try it, and then close them up again, because it seemed an impossible job. But so there wasn't, but at the beginning of the 90s, people thought, well, with computation becoming more and more powerful, maybe something could be done. And so a big campaign was done where all these fragments were cleaned, catalogued, photographed, and digitized. So this is one of the examples. So here you see that you have little fragments. It's very, oops, I think I pushed on something I didn't want to push on. Okay, so here's an example, and they were all numbered uniquely on the back. And in fact, this was an example of a few fragments that had been put together. You see there are a couple of them that they had pieced together. But the whole job consisted of, I mean, have you seen these fragments were really tiny. There was very little context on what you saw. Some fragments were uniform in color. Well, those you couldn't do anything with. But when you had some patterns on there, so it was, you could view it as a very daunting puzzle. Very daunting because you only had about 10% of the puzzle pieces. And not only that, but you didn't know really in what position you had to put them. So Massimo Fornazier came up with an approach that made it possible to for every one of the fragments that had some distinguishing features on them, to know exactly where they had to go, and that was then the basis for a big restoration project that was taken on in Padua. So how did he do that? So if you, digital images that you get on your computer screens are really collections of more or less bright points or colored points on a rectangular surface and on a rectangular grid. And so here I'm mocking up the idea that if you have a little piece of the image that corresponds to numbers, and these numbers go in an 8-bit black and white image go from 0 to 255, 0 for all black, 255 for all white, and then we have the 254 numbers in between give us many different levels of gray. So in image compression, we have 254 shades of gray and not 50 like the other people. So you, once you have them into numbers, you can then compute with them. You can try to make summaries, you can and so on, and that's what digital image processing does. You could say, well, then it's easy to recognize whether two images are identical. You just look at the numbers, and if the numbers are the same, bang, they're identical. Well, that's not really the same, not really true, because of course you can if you move a little bit in computing the numbers for the image, then they look very different. And not only that, but in our fragments, they also can be rotated with respect to each other. And so here are two arrays of numbers that correspond to exactly the same thing in gray levels, but one is rotated with respect to the other. And so, although we immediately recognize that, a computer doesn't. So what Massimo came up with was the idea of trying to represent the content, the image content on all the fragments in such a way that it would be very easy to work with it and rotate. So what he said, so for every fragment that had something on it, he would take the biggest possible circle you could draw on there. And that circle, he then decomposed into what's called circular harmonics. So here you have some examples of circular harmonics, and you see they have beautiful symmetries. They behave very well under rotation. And you can decompose any image into a superposition, anything on a disk, into a superposition of these with coefficients that you can compute. And so here's an example of the superposition of one, and then you add the right proportion of a second one, a third one, and so on. And you see, as we build it up, how we build up an image that you recognize from the fresco. So you can decompose all images in these circular harmonics. So you have a little disk of content on a fragment of fresco, and you decompose it in these circular harmonics. And the great thing is that if you then want to represent a rotated version, all you need to do for each one of these building blocks, we know exactly what the rotation corresponded to. So you can, if you have a rotation over 37 degrees, you can apply the right coefficients, these R1, R2, and so on, in the decomposition, and you immediately get the decomposition of the rotated thing. You don't have to work anymore. So since you saw in the mock-up for the chapel, they had black and white pictures of the chapels, of the frescoes before they were destroyed, very high quality pictures. So they knew the dimensions, so they had made full-scale printouts of the frescoes in black and white. And they had all these little fragments, and they wanted to know where to put them. And so what happened is that with this decomposition of circular harmonics and checking then where to go put a picture, a fast algorithm could be written now. Now, we're talking early 90s, remember. I mean, a supercomputer then could do less than your cell phone now. So it's, and they started, after the software was ready, a project where in the center of town there were little workstations where volunteers from who wanted to contribute could come and would then help one by one to identify these fragments. So what they did is they would extract a fragment from the catalog, they would launch the numerical computation, and then so here you see a fragment like that with the circle on it, and then the algorithm would, with all these different rotated versions and try all over the image, identify best candidates. And very often the best candidate that the computer identified was the right one, but others were found, and typically the top three would be displayed, and sometimes it was the second or even the third one. And so the human operator was there in order to help with that process of selecting the right one. And incidentally, that really helped getting the buy-in of the art conservators, the fact that it wasn't going to be all automatic. They weren't thinking of doing it. When you want to do something fully automatic, it's much harder. If for some tasks you can use the input of humans who have a lot I mean, it's very easy to recognize that it's not going to, this fragment is not going to be a little bit of the decoration in the columns, for instance. And so all the fragments that had content were identified that way by volunteers, and this decomposition that made it possible to work fast. And so this is an example of the fragments on that particular fresco. And this is another one. Now you might say, how does that help? Well, it helps enormously. because if you have a little bit of information about color and you know the structure of the design otherwise, you can get a lot out of it. I mean, for instance, here, you see you have the information about the tiles, you know the leather protection on the leg, you know the color of his leg and his toes, you know the color of the lance, you know the back of the shield, and so on. So you can propagate that. And again, or here. Here, let me give you an example. If I have this and I know these fragments, then you can, and in this case it's propagated by doing mathematical, by propagating color via in-painting techniques. So if you now go to Padua, you will see this restoration in the church. And what they decided to do here, it was while it was being done, but here's a wall as it can be seen now. What they decided to do was to paint in some areas with the full color, but in pastel, to show the difference between the original fragments and the in-painted ones, and to, in other places, leave the information that they had, I mean, to show how the process had worked. But you can also, of course, do mathematically. So virtually, you can also in-paint it completely, and that's another piece of work that Massimo did. So this is a beautiful example of how a mathematical understanding helped in putting it together, and then mathematics can help in making things, giving you a virtual idea of what things must have looked like. Another project that I think is very nice and shows very nice impact of mathematics on art conservation is work by Rick Johnson on automatic thread counting. Now, Rick Johnson is an electrical engineer at Cornell University, and he is the guy who actually got me into using image processing for art conservation. He had, on a sabbatical in Europe, got in touch via friends, common friends. He had got acquainted with Conservators in the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam, and he told them how impressed he was, how much use of science they made. They used chemistry, chemical analysis, they used X-rays, infrared, refractometry, and so on. But he says, you don't really use image analysis. I said, well, why would we? We are highly trained visual experts, which they are, and what would image analysis do for us? And he said, well, it's not my own field. He was working in audio at that time. He says, but I know teams that work on image analysis. If you let me give them high-resolution data of your paintings, then I can try to convince them to organize a workshop where they show what they can do with these. And so he brokered that, because actually getting high-resolution data of paintings is getting easier these days from museums, but then it was very, very hard. They kept it very close to their chest because somebody had told them that that was their intellectual property. And so they didn't, I had to sign my soul away to get access to these Van Gogh data. But they never leaked, and so we still have them, and I'm still in possession of my soul. But what... As the workshops developed and we did things, and Rick Johnson also learned that they were, at the time, writing what they call a catalogue raisonné, which is a book in which you try to write for every painting, everything that's known. Every single fact, everything that some scholar has decided on, and so on. And one of the things they do in writing about paintings on canvas is they characterize the canvas. And so you might say, well, that's easy to do. I mean, why don't you just turn it over and you can take a photograph of the canvas without a painting? Well, it's not that easy, in fact, because most paintings in museums have been what's called relined. Oil paint contains ingredients that over time will actually attack the integrity of the textile fibers of which a canvas is made. And so many of these canvases have threads in such poor condition that really threatens the integrity of the artwork. And so what is done is that a different canvas is then usually applied to the back with glue and a hot iron. That's the way it used to be done. But so how can they then see the canvas? Because on the back you only see this relining. Well, they actually see see the canvas through X-rays of the painting. And so here you have an X-ray of that same painting in the corner, and you clearly see the canvas. But that seems very peculiar. I mean, X-rays go straight through fabric. How can we see canvas? Well, you don't see the canvas. What happens is that to prepare a canvas for painting on it, you put a layer of primer, and in order to make the canvas much less absorbent, so that paint doesn't immediately go away in this fabric. So that layer is, until fairly recently, was a layer that contained lead white, a lot of lead white. And when you have canvas, you have all these valleys between threads. When you put your lead white on it, it will give you a slightly thicker layer where you had a valley and a thinner layer where you had a mountain. And so that lead white, of course, lead is something that you really see in X-rays. So you see this varying thickness of that primer in the canvas. And so even paintings on canvas for which the canvas has completely gone, if the canvas is so bad that they actually remove all the threads before relining it, you still see the X-ray of the original canvas. So this is an X-ray and a reverse. So what people did until Rick Johnson's work was to look at the canvas and to count under the microscope the number of threads, so many threads per inch, horizontally, vertically, and so on. Do that in a number of spots until they got too bored and their eyes too tired to do it, and that was that. And Rick said, but that is something we can do automatically. I mean, of course. And so we had, it's quite interesting that canvas, you might think it's horizontal and vertical threads, but this one is one where you see very clearly that the threads are undulating. And, well, you could say, couldn't they put it straighter on the stretcher before they ironed it, before they painted it? Well, no, because primer is applied if you buy canvas in bulk, then you buy a whole roll of primed canvas. And the primer, if the canvas was a little bit wavy, the primer fixes that. You cannot then readjust it. So, so what you can do is, and that's what Rick did, take little pieces of it, and then do a Fourier transform, which tells you what a frequency, how frequently there are oscillations. I mean, and in this, you see that there are oscillations, black, white, black, white, black, white. And so you can then find, he would then do that everywhere and make the information visible. He had 4 ways of telling you things. I mean, for the vertical threads, for instance, he could tell you how frequent the threads were. When do you have 12 threads per inch? When do you have 13, and so on. And you could also look at deviation of true vertical. And you could also do the horizontal, how frequent, what the density was, and then deviation from horizontal. And so these pictures, in order to display the information, he showed in color how deviant things were from the average. So you tell you the average angle, the average density, and then deviations from that. But that gave a completely different way of looking at it. First of all, they had it everywhere, automatically, not and so on. But then they realized you had patterns in there, and you could recognize the same patterns from one painting to another. If, as Van Gogh did, and many artists did, he had bought a big roll of canvas and then cut it into pieces in order to stretch it and make paintings, you could actually see that things were from the same roll, so they're roll mates. And so, for instance, these paintings of Van Gogh's early period, we now know that on the roll they were situated like this because you have patterns in one of these and you have this kind of pattern in another. And so this connection really is very beautiful. And it came about because of this way of mathematically extracting information and then trying to visualize it and then seeing things that nobody had ever realized you could see. And so this method has is now used on all paintings on canvas and has been instrumental in, for instance, authenticating a Velázquez painting. I mean, there was a painting by Velázquez that was just not quite as good as his top masterworks, and people had said, well, it's probably school of Velázquez. But they now know by these techniques that it was a roll mate of 2 masterworks, And Velázquez didn't use his costly canvas and just lend it to students. So, I mean, it was probably by him, but on not as good a day. So the first project we did with the Van Gogh Museum was a project in which they asked us, could we recognize style? Could we recognize copies from forgeries? And we did work on that, and I don't want to talk about it, because one of the things I've experienced is that as I work on this and I talk in venues where there are art historians or art conservators also present, then very often they come to me afterwards and they say, if you could do this, then maybe you can help us with that. I mean, so this was the second project, I call it Lady 6 millimeters Unders, and you will see why, although it's not a name that people in art history like. That was the second generation project, I mean, but it was much more interesting than the first generation. So more interesting projects have been coming out of the woodwork. So this particular one was a challenge that was given to me by Joris Dick and Koen Janssen. Joris Dick and Koen Janssen are two material scientists. Joris Dick is also an art historian. And so he had proposed that they use X-ray fluorescence methods to investigate a painting by Van Gogh that was particularly interesting. So, and when they did this research, it made a big flash and it got the cover of Analytic Chemistry. So the painting is this little painting. It's a painting of Bloeiend Polletgras, a patch of grass in his Paris period. And underneath that painting, and that had been known for a long time, this is the X-ray of that painting, there was another one. Now, it's not so unusual that paintings by Van Gogh have something underneath, especially many of his smaller paintings have about 30% have something else underneath, because he would use them as a study, and when he had learned what he wanted to learn, well, canvas was expensive, he would put a new layer of primer and make another painting. Now, this particular painting, however, intrigued people because the portrait is a portrait of, that fits in the portraits of peasants that he painted in his period in Nuenen when he was still living with his parents. And that's a period when all his life he kept up a voluminous correspondence with his brother, who was living in Paris. And there's a letter that survives from written to his brother where he says, as you know, I've been experimenting for a long time with a very somber palette and trying to capture color in this somber palette. And I think I'm really getting there. And I'm sending you with this letter a painting in which I feel I've particularly well succeeded. And he described the painting, and there is, among the surviving hundreds of Nuenen portraits, not a single one that corresponds to that. On the other hand, this letter went to Paris. And in Paris, after he joins his brother, he meets the Impressionists. His style of painting changes completely. It's not so unlikely that, having changed his style of painting, he would no longer value this one painting that he felt was particularly successful, and so that he would use it to paint something else on top. So people believe that the painting described in that letter was this one. So they were very interested in seeing, well, what's underneath there. And so Joris Dick proposed that they analyze it with X-ray fluorescence. And that's a method in which you send very little area of the painting, you send high energy X-rays, and they ionize atoms, and things fall back in 2 steps. And so you have light gets sent out with absorption of the electron, but because in the second step you go from one level of the atom to another one, the wavelength of the light sent out is characteristic for the atom you're looking at. And so the fluorescence tells you, oops, I'm seeing some of that element, or I have now that wavelength, so I'm seeing some of that element. And so in different frequencies, you get different information. So this is the image you get in a strong line for asbestos, which was a component of the vermilion that Van Gogh was using, and you see the lips are coming out strongly. This is antimony, which was part of the Naples yellow he was using. And so you see, this is probably the only light color he had on his palette. And so it gives you an impression of the luminescence of... So using that information, Joris Dick and Koen Janssen had kind of colorized things. They were missing some lines, and so, but already this gave a much better impression of the painting than people had seen before, and that's why it was so striking. And he said, can you guys who know image analysis, we are material scientists, we did this in Photoshop, colorizing it, maybe you can do more. And so he asked us whether we could. And so it turned out it was an interesting mathematical challenge, because he gave us the raw data. He said, the first thing you'll have to do, because we kind of fudged that by hand, but is correct for something that happened while we registered the data. So now, because this method is very successful, little portable machines have been used that can be used built that can be used in a museum, and it takes a while. I mean, they scan little area by little area over a painting, but they can do that overnight, and you have your data in the morning. But then, this was the first time that this happened, so they transported the painting to a high-energy X-ray source. And where was that? That was in a hospital, where the X-ray source, its day job was to make short-lived radioactive elements used in medical testing. And because these machines are expensive, what happened is that typically when they're built and since they're not used all the time for their medical use, there's also an experimentation chamber next door in which physicists can use the beam for physical experiments, and that helps pay for it. So they had gotten hours on this machine, and the painting with, I mean, it had taken quite a lot of negotiation with insurance to actually, you're going to bring this Van Gogh painting to a medical instant, I mean, X-ray, I mean, anyway, so they had managed, and the painting was on a sled and was exposed little bit by little bit to these X-rays. Now, every so often, the beam had to go back to what its job was, and then the whole thing had to halt. And then when it came back, things could start up again. And there had been a synchrony problem. And so the scanning was done in zigzag, and the result of that synchrony problem is that you had this kind of artifacts all over, because it had not been in the place where you thought it was when it was giving you the data. And these they had corrected by hand by taking line by line and adjusting them in Photoshop. But these breaks were happening all over the place. And so the first thing we did was we designed an algorithm that had to estimate when did breaks happen and how would you best adjust it and so on. It was an iterative algorithm that after many swipes through did a much better job of aligning all that. So next, we inpainted. So these black blotches are because the painting on top of the blooming grass had impasto on it, which Van Gogh started using a lot, and X-rays hadn't penetrated in, so you had no information. But you had no information from the X-ray measurement, but of course you could see it's a painting. You could see the brushstroke before and after. So you could easily reconstruct what should have been in between. So we used methods, I mean, we put a mask on top, and then we used these methods to inpaint. And we used a different method to look at the long stretches that came from the grass on top, and we inpainted those too. And then we still had one eye that was kind of not so great. And we asked the art historians, they say, oh, you use the other eye. We do that all the time. So we did too. And so now we had this. And we had it in, and here you see how the inpainting is very delicate. So we had we had tidied things up, and then we looked at color information that we had. Now, the color information was not sufficient. We were missing a whole range of earth colors, and so also we didn't have the blue in the spectrum they gave us. But what we did is we analyzed portraits that Van Gogh painted in this period, somewhat very heavy and very low contrast. And surprisingly, and this is not something that's obvious to the naked eye, when you took away the contrast and the luminance, the spread in the spectrum was virtually identical for even high cross and low contrast. So we could use that in order to infer from what we had seen the missing colors. And when we did all that, that's what we ended up with. And so, so she really came to life much more, and we were very happy about that. So, I mean, so then I had another talk to give, and when I joined North Carolina, I, by serendipity, met William Brown and Noel Ocon, who are conservators, and they had heard a talk on that work, and they said, would you be interested in working with us? And I said, sure. And it's been wonderful because they're very open-minded, they have no problem sharing data, and we've done a number of interesting things, and I'd like to tell you about those now. So here, Rachel Yin is one of my students who's finishing now. She's very, very, very smart and very bright, and she's on the market. Bruno Cornelis is a postdoc who is in Brussels. Jean Feng Lu is one of my colleagues at Duke. Bill Brown and Noel Ocon are conservators. David Steele is a curator at the North Carolina Museum of Art. And Charlotte Caspers, well, you'll hear more of her. She's a Dutch artist. So the first work we did, and we're still working on that, the first work on which we started was a work on this beautiful altarpiece by Giotto, in which they said that well, first of all, it's not completely certain in what order the panels were, because like many altarpieces, when it went from being in a church to becoming something that collectors coveted, it was separated in panels. Dealers would separate in panels because although a big altarpiece sells for more than one panel, 5 panels sell for much more than one altarpiece. So it was sawn into pieces, and then you have to decide how did they fit together before. And it's not, so there is some question about what is the best order. But even more so, art historians really feel that there's a difference in painting sophistication between John the Baptist, for instance, or the Virgin Mary. And so they wanted to analyze difference in hands and so on. And we're working on that, and we had some preliminary results, and we want to do more. And so that will be for another time. But while we were discussing this, Bill Brown told me about another altarpiece about which they had a kind of a dream. I mean, so it's much less famous. But it's a really beautiful 14th century little altarpiece. It's of which the North Carolina Museum of Art has 3 panels. It has 3 panels because it got those from the Kress Foundation. Samuel Kress had at some point department stores in not the biggest cities, but regional cities in the US, and that made his fortune. He became an art collector, and by his will, he arranged that many of those pieces would go to the museums in the cities where he had built his fortune, which I think is a very classy thing. And so 3 of them are in North Carolina Museum of Art. 3 were not acquired by Kress, were acquired by a different collector who donated them to the Metropolitan Museum. A 4th painting was also from the Kress collection and went to Portland because he had a store there as well. The central one is in Chicago, and it's only in the 70s that people realized that these paintings belong together as pieces of one altarpiece, and there's no question about that. And the North Carolina Museum of Art wanted to bring them together, to reunite them for the first time. And the other museums, I mean, they said this is all the paintings are in the US. It's easier to bring them together within the country than to bring them from outside the country. But the other museums were not all that interested because they said, even if you have them all, there's a missing panel. So when this altarpiece was split up to sell it to collectors, it's unknown what happened to it. It's missing from the record. People have no idea where it is, and they have looked a long time and written to many people and so on, and it may have been lost forever. And so they said, well, it's true, we wouldn't have it together. And I put them in touch with Charlotte Caspers, who I mentioned earlier. Charlotte Caspers is a fantastic artist, but she's also trained as an art historian and an art conservator. And she's a very creative person, and she invented a new job. I mean, and so she works now for museums, and actually there's now a series even on Dutch television in which she features, where she reconstructs artwork with the techniques that were used by the artist when it was done. So here in the previous one, you see her working on a reconstruction of the Ghent, a portion of the Ghent altarpiece, which is a very, very famous painting. And they commissioned a reconstruction that would stop in 3 different stages so that people can now see a partially reconstructed one, not finished, to get an... Here's another one that she made where she stopped short in every layer of preparing it another 1/4 of an inch. And so you have all the layers of wood and then gesso and so on. It's only here that she starts painting. I mean, so all the previous things have taken months of preparation because these things have to dry. So I told them about this and about the fact that she had this, and we had worked together on, I'm going to a little bit too slow, so I can't tell you about all these, but I can tell you about it afterwards. And I said you could commission a reconstruction of this missing panel. Now, a missing panel is not the same as a panel that you reconstruct. I mean, how do you make it? And so she actually made a design together with the curator of the missing scene. So how would they know what the missing scene was? Well, this painting, apart from the central panel, tells the life of John the Evangelist. I mean, you could recognize that from the colors. If you remember your hagiography, pink, this kind of purplish pink and blue are the colors of St. John. And you see him here at the foot of the cross at the crucifixion, but then later here's his whole life. Now, how that life followed, oh shoot, I don't have it here. How do we know what scenes of the life to follow? Well, they followed what's called the Golden Legend, which was a medieval book that was a bestseller. I mean, we know it was a bestseller because many books we only have fragments of, but that book we have numerous copies, complete. So apparently everybody wanted their own. And so the scenes in that in the painting follow the highlights of the life of St. John. And so the last scene was probably a baptism. And so, indeed, they made then a scene, they composed the scene of the baptism, and there's a whole story about trying to construct it in such a way that it used elements in the composition from the other panels to try to put as little own invention into it, so that it will certainly, if they ever find this panel, be different from the real panel, but this one would not have surprised. I mean, it would have been... So Charlotte did this, and she went through all the stages. Here you see her putting gold on the bolus and polishing it and punching it. Actually, I think I can while I talk on, I can show you a little bit of that. So here she is. Punches had to be made. You'll see how she's going to punch the gold. I mean, so these punches were done in 14th century Italy because these gold panels would be in these chapels and all the reflections of all the candles and the windows. And then where you had the punch work, you would have light reflected in better ways, in different ways. And so she did all that punch work, and then she painted, and so it became a beautiful little panel. And you can. I'll show you where you can see more of this. I know it's very tantalizing showing you a piece of video and then not the rest. But a beautiful painting resulted, and so they could have the thing together, and they made a documentary of how it was made and so on. And then I said, oh my God, we have this bright, beautiful painting. Everybody will be so excited. And if we put it together with all the rest, everybody will look only at it. I mean, and not at the authentic 14th century panels. I mean, and there was too much of a disjoint thing. So I said, well, maybe mathematics can help. And so indeed, I mean, here you see the difference. I mean, it's not a sharp picture, but you see the difference in aspect of the old and the new panels. So what we did is we studied the old panels, and we studied their characteristics, their crack map, the way colors, because Charlotte had used exactly the same pigments. They had been analyzed first, and so we knew what they looked like new, and we knew what they looked like old. She had not only used the same pigments, but the same painting technique, because we know a teaching manual for painters from the 14th century by Cennino Cennini that clearly had been followed by this painter. So we knew we had new and old. And so we prepared a virtually aged copy of the 9th panel. And that copy was then printed. And that is what is in the panel when it's reunited now. And if you are in Raleigh before March 5th, you should go see this exhibit. That's when it closes. It's running right now. After that, it will go to Portland. So if you're in Portland between April and June, you can see the exhibit there. But because we had studied all that and done the virtual aging, we could do the reverse also. We could rejuvenate the old panels. We could go back from old to new. And, well, why was I so sure that we could, I mean, find these cracks and study them and do things with them? Because we had done it before. So here again is this painting by Van Eyck, the altarpiece, of which you saw Charlotte paint a little reconstruction. And it's a fantastic painting. It was extremely influential in its time. It's a huge polyptych. If you close it, this is what you see. And people had been wondering about the depiction of a book in the Annunciation scene. And if you look at the book, and so we're talking now about something that's maybe 3 inches high on this huge polyptych, it's painted very realistically. I mean, it shows this manuscript in what's called written in littera formata, which is a very stylized way of writing, which I don't recognize anything, just horizontal and vertical little lines. So I couldn't read this, but experts also in these books couldn't read this. And they couldn't read it because the crack pattern was too distracting to them. It was it obscured some letters, and it was impossible for them to think it away. And the thing is full of cracks. I mean, if it's one crack, you can. And so I had said when I was told this, maybe we could help, we could find these cracks automatically. If I had known how difficult that was going to be, I might not have said anything, because it turned out it was really hard. Because you see, it's not that the cracks are just uniform brown and so on. Anything you think of that you might easily do in Photoshop just doesn't work, let me tell you. So it became a detailed mathematical analysis and so on, but it became part of the thesis of Bruno Cornelis in Belgium, and he did succeed. And so then once you have found the cracks, you can use in-painting methods. And so we did that, and that's what you get here on the right. And I thought, well, when I first saw the results, I mean, fat lot of good that has done. I mean, it's just as illegible as before. But to experts, it wasn't. They said, oh my God, look at this. This is not really what we thought. It's part of a W. I said, okay. Anyway, but with the in-painted version, they could recognize not just that there were more letters than they thought, but they could recognize 12 groups of words. And the 12 groups of words were sufficient to not just convince them that Van Eyck had really painted the text, not painted an imitation of what could look like a text if you looked at it from far enough, but they could identify the text itself. And it turns out it's a text that was copied in Bruges 20 years earlier from a manuscript of Thomas Morris on the Annunciation. So they were really, not Thomas Morris, Thomas of Aquinas, sorry. Thomas of Aquinas on the Annunciation, they were really excited by that, because not only was it a real text, Van Eyck is a perfectionist, they might have expected that, but they now there was some meaning in that scene to choosing that text. So now they actually are hoping that, since several copies were made at the time, to identify exactly which copy was used on loan, given on loan to Van Eyck for the painting. So we had experience in finding cracks automatically. So I knew we could do that for the Ghissi altarpiece. And that led to another little side thing. Because in the Ghent altarpiece, it had been very, very useful to find the cracks to look at the X-rays, because they stand out so much more nicely on the X-ray. And so when I asked people at North Carolina to show me the X-rays, these X-rays had this very funny things on them, these marks as if the figures were behind bars in a prison. I say, what's that kind of nonsense? Doesn't that bother you? I said, yes, it bothers us. It's the cradle. Cradle. Okay. Again, some history. These panels originally were painted on things that were an inch or thicker. And they hung on the walls of churches. When they were taken down from the churches, because at a time when people didn't value this old art as much, and also when the churches needed money to repair the roof, and collectors were willing to pay good money, collectors wanted to have something that wouldn't be this big chunk of wood that warped easily according to temperature or humidity on their walls. So it was the practice of conservators then, who worked for the collectors, to thin the panel much more, so that, and then put a lattice of hardwood on the back that would keep it much more rigid. In some cases, they also did it because they wanted to remove wood with worms in it or damaged wood, as you see here. But in any case, once you then take X-rays, you see mostly not the details of the brushwork that you were looking at, but mostly that lattice, that cradle. So I said, well, I've never seen that in publications. They say, no, we spent hours and hours and hours in Photoshop trying to remove that before we publish it. So I said, well, maybe we can do that automatically. Of course, again, it was not as easy as you might think. It's never truly horizontal, never truly vertical. But also, when by then the conservators started to have a healthy respect for what we could do. And they said, you know what, it would be really great, and that is something we cannot possibly do, if we want to see the wood grain of the original panel, because that helps us in our conservation. But we hate to see the wood grain of the cradle. So that then was really challenging, and that became a very interesting machine learning project, because what you have is you have places where you, first of all, you have to separate wood grain from everything else. But then when you have wood grain, you have to learn places where you have one type of wood grain and places where you have a superposition of two others, and then remove one species and leave in the others. So Rachel did that, and so here actually you see an example of what our algorithm did, and here what professional art conservators did for the same thing with Photoshop, and you see we did it better. And then we got a grant from, so here's an example of a painting in North Carolina Museum of Art and the cradle, and removed with the algorithm. So we got, here's another one actually. Yeah, and here you see very nicely all that wood grain that's in there. Wood grain from the panel that they wanted to keep, but wood grain from the cradle that they didn't want to keep. Here is another one. And so what we did, we actually got a grant from an art foundation because we now had an algorithm that worked. It was an algorithm in MATLAB. It could just as well have been in Martian as far as art conservators were concerned. So we got a grant in order to port this to a plugin for Photoshop, which art conservators can use. And actually, so it was the first time that I wrote a proposal for an art foundation, and I got the most interesting letter back that I've ever gotten from a funding agency. It said, this was a very unusual proposal for us, very interesting, And it led to one of the most lively board meetings in recent memory. I mean, so I guess there must have been people who said, oh, this is great, let's do it. And others who said, are you crazy? Are good money for this? Anyway, we got funded, and so we developed the software, and we made it available to, we had a workshop for conservators, and we have a platform that I can show you here in, okay. So if you are curious about this, you can go to projectplatypus.net, which is where you can download the software to remove cradles. We have a gallery in which you can see many paintings before and after. And we have since actually, by luck, we heard of a painting on which, in the Prado, where people were removing the cradle physically, because it was starting, the stresses it put on the panel were starting to crack the panel. And so that meant that we had a situation where we could have the X-ray as it was cradled, and then the X-ray after the cradle was physically removed. So we have a ground truth test, I mean, which was very important in order to get this result published. I mean, publications want to see ground truth testing. And we wrote it in open source, so we hope that as conservators want to do more with it than we can, than we did, people will actually be interested in expanding it. And platypus, so platypus, it's called platypus because we had virtual cradle removal tool and so on, tried to make a nice acronym of that. And so the developer said, we need a name. And so we tried and we couldn't. And then the conservator said, maybe it doesn't have to mean anything. Maybe it should just be something that people remember. Something silly, like platypus, as platypus. So actually, I have in my office the cradle, doll's cradle, with a very big stuffed platypus, and platypus can come out of the cradle. We hope that platypus will learn more tricks, and because we have more tools that we'd like to develop. But you can see the whole story of the Ghissi altarpiece, and actually the movie that I didn't show you, of which I showed you only a fragment, at this website, Duke IPAI. IPAI stands for Image Processing Art Investigation, .org and Project Ghissi. And I want to finish with a little, at the very bottom, oh, yes, no, I want to show you something else. We have, we have, for each of the paintings, we only had, for the one from the NCMA, we could see them in reality, but the other ones, we only had one high-resolution photograph, and from the museums. And this is the one that we had from Portland. Because they were taken by different museums under very different conditions. And so we actually have a way in which you can go between the old and the new version, with, which we really like. But even nicer, I mean, the gold is very hard to show you what it will look like when in reality, because how do you see that something is metal? You see it because it reflects, and it reflects differently when you move your head. I mean, that's when you, I mean, the shine on it. Although I could show you a little bit of what gold looks like here, that was actually, I'm really cheating here in the gold. What I did is I found on Wikimedia a gold sheet that I put behind it. I mean, the rest of it we did the scholarly way, but for rendering the gold, I had to resort to something like that. But I then realized that in order to really show it, you had to really make a 3D model, use computer graphics, in which you would use the reflectance of. So we worked then with computer graphics people to get a movie which you can see on the website. But I think I'm going to try to show you it in the full version here. Okay, so this is the result of rejuvenating all these panels and gilding them and having the punch marks. The punch marks are as punch marks. We found the locations and then we made the model. And this is part of the exhibit. So the thing about the exhibit is that you have the reunited altarpiece with the virtually aged one. You have a documentary on how it was painted. You have the new panel. You have the materials. And then you have one wall that explains all the digital stuff that we did. I mean, the fact that there was so much image processing and mathematics that played a role in it. And the exhibit has been extremely successful. I mean, at first, the conservators were afraid that with reuniting a 14th century altarpiece that was not very famous, not by a very famous, nor even a top quality artist, would attract maybe 5 people. But it turns out that this mix of different aspects has really appealed to lots of people, and so it's a very successful exhibit right now. And I wanted to end by saying that, I should have said that earlier on, but I've not shown you any mathematics at all. I mean, I've shown you lots of pictures. And I had a colleague at Bell Labs who said, a picture is worth 1,000 words. Yes, he says, but if you have the 1,000 words. And I promise you, I do have the 1,000 formulas for all I showed you. But thank you.
Questions? So we have 2 microphones. If you have questions, or yeah, maybe if you're in the middle.
Oops.
Yeah, maybe.
Oh, thank you. From the X-ray fluorescence analysis, which elements turned out to be the most important?
The antimony was, in what we got, the most important. They now try to look at a wider range of spectrum in order to get, so it depends a little bit. But for us, the antimony was most important because it gave us the luminescence. I mean, since it was the only light color he used, it was a good proxy for where were there lighter portions and darker portions. It's really only the antimony and the arsine that were extremely useful for us.
And arsenic?
Yeah.
Yeah. And were you able to use the combination of fluorescence from 2 or more elements?
Yeah, there was also one for, so I'm blanking right now. There were a couple more elements that gave us a little bit more information. But that was the very first one. I mean, since then, they can do much more. But and so I think Joris Dick now uses them has used them for a whole lot of different projects. I'm going to meet him in a couple of months in Antwerp, and we are going to explore other instances in which we could try to color things again with image analysis and his data. And
thank you.
Thank you very much for a wonderful talk. The fresco
yes.
fragments that you were talking about, can you give a sense of the amount of time that it took for the initial arrangement of the fragments, the volunteers that were helping, and then the reconstruction?
Yeah, it took several months. Several months of people. Well, they had to do 88,000 fragments. And I'm saying this was in the middle of the 90s. I mean, it would be we would be able to do it much faster now, but still, I mean, but it was also a nice aspect of it. I mean, there was this place where people would come, volunteer, would sign up for when they would come and so on, because they had only 2 terminals for it, and so it was something in which the community participated, and that was a very nice aspect of it too.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm an art conservator here
Oh,
at Stanford.
Great.
I work in the Art and Science Learning Lab at the Cantor, and we do kind of similar projects. And I was wondering kind of how you got into this, I guess.
Well, I've been working on the mathematical aspects of image processing I'd been working on that for many years, and so as Eleni said, some of my work made its work into image compression standards. Actually, that was a JPEG 2000 standard, not JPEG. The JPEG that's used for standard JPEG is based on DCT. The JPEG 2000 is a bit more advanced and is used for many internet applications and also for digital cinema. And that's JPEG 2000. But so I was working on that. And then Rick Johnson, actually, as I said, he brokered this workshop idea of people who worked on image analysis showing what we could do with high-resolution images, whether there were questions we could answer, information we could give that they might be interested in and that they would not have. That was not a question of just looking at it very carefully and being a great visual expert. And so the very first the workshop, they gave us challenges. I mean, the challenge was, could we style? Could we recognize among paintings that authentic paintings, could we recognize a forgery? Could we, and we could, but I mean, it's as often when you do this kind of recognition or clustering or so on, I'm not sure that in all cases we really traced it exactly to what they would have considered relevant. In one of the tasks, for instance, the Nova television program Nova got wind of this and gave us a challenge, and there's still a snippet on the internet the challenge they gave us a week before the workshop. They gave us 6 copies of high-resolution scans of paintings, 5 of which were authentic Van Goghs and 1 was a copy. And actually, that's how I met Charlotte, because they had commissioned her do that copy. And so on that snippet that you can see on internet, you see the moment when we first met. I mean, in any case, when the painting was shown, and we had all the 3 teams of image analysis who had worked on it had found the right one. But in our case, I cannot guarantee that we found the right copy because we recognized the difference in hand. I believe that we may have recognized that it was a more recent photograph. I mean, which we had not thought of might be biasing our analysis. Fortunately, we wanted to validate the fact that we could recognize copies from originals, and we have done other experiments. So that's one of the things I commissioned from Charlotte. We have commissioned from her a series of small paintings that she then, with her copying technique, copied herself. And the copies typically take longer than the original painting. I mean, because that meticulous copying is something more painstaking than spontaneous painting. And we can, the same hand, the same light circumstances, the same materials, we can reliably recognize one from the other. We have a data set for which we haven't actually unveiled all of them. The first data set, we did it like machine learning people do. I mean, we say we use this for training and that for testing and so on. But art historians don't believe it as much if you do it that way. I mean, so we now have a blind data set on which the information has been under seal, kept in the art history department, and we do one after the other as we refine our techniques. And so far, we've been right every time. But so that was an interesting question, but I like some of these other questions much more, like Lady 6 millimeters under, or, I mean, that was making her, I mean, there was some, in all these projects, I'm interested, and I can only justify having students working on them if there are interesting mathematical problems in them. So having the automatic adjustment of all the lines and inferring color from partial information and so on were interesting mathematical problems. the cradle removal was a very interesting machine learning problem. I mean, that required a delicate analysis in order to make it work. The Ghissi, actually, for the Ghissi altarpiece, the rejuvenation and the virtual aging, that was done with off-the-shelf tools, but off-the-shelf image processing tools. Well, one was this crack finding, which had been a research project, but now we have the software. But so that became a project with undergraduates. I mean, so we had a team of undergrads who worked on different aspects of it, and we would meet up every week and talk about progress. They would interface with the art conservators about, did we do the right color? Because as I said, except for the one at CMA, we only had one color picture, and they were under completely different circumstances. Actually, I was amazed when the exhibition came that the panels looked so similar, because the photographs had looked so dissimilar. I mean, it's really it's gorgeous. I mean, but so they needed guidance on, and so they interfaced. So it became a very interesting project. They had to learn the math in order to be able to do it, and then they had the nitty-gritty. And then on the digital wall of the exhibit, we have little movies that feature each one of the big components, and I really wanted the undergrads to explain it. And so there are many different aspects that came into it. But, I mean, I think that the exhibit, so it will travel to Portland, and then after that, all the paintings will go their own way. But NCMA will have the frame, it will have the 3 original panels, it will have that reconstructed one. I think this, and together with the digital stuff, that might be something very interesting for university museums to maybe arrange for a visit of the, so.
Thank you very much. I think the collaborations are really great, and if anybody is interested, we're always looking for people to collaborate with. Again, it's the Art and Science Learning Lab at the Cantor. So.
So, is it possible that all of the X-ray radiation exposure could possibly affect the paintings and pieces that you were scanning?
Okay, that's a very good question. In fact, that was the first, when I heard about this high energy X-ray source for the luminescence, of course that was a question. Of course, all these methods have been tested extensively on mocked up things, in order to see whether indeed and in the case of the high energy X-ray, they do it just a tiny little area at the time, and the little bit of heat that gets generated is completely dispersed before they do the next one. So they're very, very careful with these paintings. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, and the whole thing is we want to be completely non-invasive. And I think what these virtual methods make possible is to think of having pieces of art that are too fragile to try to bring back or to do the conservation effort, or you might not want to because the history of its aging is part of the object itself. But the idea that you can at the same time stabilize the object and you have the real object, but also get an impression of what it must have looked like when new, but not a gaudy thing, but something that's based on scholarship, I think is a very nice way of helping, giving extra dimensions to these pieces of art.
Thank you.
There's another one.
Can you say a few words which machine learning techniques were the most useful for your work on art reconstruction?
So for the platypus thing, we used Bayesian methods in order to do the learning of the wood. I mean, so we first used decomposition of images into different layers of, I mean, cartoon, fine features and so on. And we then looked at orientation of fine features. We looked at them with curvelets to extract long strands. And then we then used undercurvelet decompositions. I mean, the curvelet decompositions in order to filter out the wood grain. And then once we had the wood grain, we used Bayesian techniques in order to distinguish the two populations and to remove one. For the crack finding, we used again, we used 3 different filters actually in order to locate these structures and distinguish them from the letters. And we looked at the confidence with which the methods gave us, and we used a voting scheme there in order to decide were we crack or not. And,
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your talk. I'm trained as an art historian, and I'm familiar with Bernard Berenson's work from the last century. He took photographs of lots of paintings and tried to attribute them to individual artists by looking at fingernails and earlobes, the kinds of things that an artist would do out of habit. And I was wondering whether or not there were any ideas to apply mathematical kinds of analysis to his work and use that same kind of thing for attributing things to individual artists' hands.
Yeah, I don't know. I know that connoisseurship and so on is based on looking what kind of tricks artists have for looking at for rendering or realizing earlobes, or for instance, there are artists, if you have little figures in the distance, who don't paint the necks. I mean, some who do. I mean, things like that. So I haven't tried to, we have not, but it might be interesting to actually try to make that more systematic and make that into a database. Something that we have done work on, and we're not, we hope we could still do better in the future than we are able to do now, is to recognize shapes. I mean, because many workshops had examples. I mean, so if you had a boat that had to be shown in 3/4 profile with 2 fishermen in it, I mean, then they had examples that are used in etchings, in prints, in drawings, in oil paintings, and so on. And you find the same shape all over. So how do you extract, how do you start recognizing that? I mean, because people have done that by hand in a certain sense, but it would be nice to be able to do that more automatically, so that you would just give, people could then use that in order to infer much more and do their art history work on it. We've tried, and we've gotten somewhere, but not as far as we would have liked. I mean, so there's a lot still that needs to be done, and we are also another project on which we're working is a canvas that's painted on 2 sides. I didn't even know people did that. I mean, panels are often, and altarpieces are often painted on 2 sides in polyptychs. But many of those with the cradling have been split in 2 and then cradled. Some of them have not been. So in the altarpiece of Ghent, there is, you had Adam and Eve on the doors outside, very little clad. And in the 19th century, when they did most of this cradling, they also wanted to show all these paintings, both the outside and the inside, simultaneously. So they took them and split them so that they could show both halves. But Adam and Eve, they thought, were so naked that they commissioned instead 2 new versions with a bit more leaf work. So the result is that those paintings have never been split. And now when they want to study them, they have X-rays. If they take an X-ray, they see both sides. And so, but they want to actually really look at brushwork in the X-rays. And again, it's something we're very, very bad at doing, splitting. I mean, you see the 2, you have 2 visuals, but splitting these 2, I mean, so what we're trying to do is learning the correspondence between X-ray and the original, so that we can then use that, because we have the 2 visuals, to split that 1 double X-ray into 2. And we're doing that. We're doing that also with a canvas that was painted on 2 sides, where the owner of the canvas hopes that it's actually by a famous painter. I think it's very unlikely. And I tell him, I said, I'm not going to say anything about that. I mean, but we can look at brushwork and look at details and so on. I mean, but I try be very, very careful not ever to get into real attribution issues, because, I mean, that would be enough to make museums start not wanting to work with me. And I don't have the expertise anyway. And the fun thing for me is the math, and it's exactly the same math. Whether the thing is truly by that famous painter or by somebody else. I mean, the X-ray separation is the same. So I try to stay away from attribution. But I think what you're saying would be very interesting. Digital humanities, and which is a buzzword right now.
I have sort of 4 interlacing questions. So one was, math can obviously be applied in huge amounts of situations and huge amounts of both specialized and non-specialized discipline. And I was wondering what you think are the limitations and challenges on math and applying it in arts and humanities and a variety of different things. I was also wondering, with challenges you faced in your Cradle project, but in other projects too, what you thought were particularly good strategies for overcoming what seems like a limitation or a challenge or an immovable obstacle. And then I was wondering as well, what drew you to art in particular to use mathematics, because you could obviously use it in a variety of ways, and what makes those problems particularly interesting, as well as you said a lot of the museums, I think, at first were very skeptical of your work and what you could do for them with mathematics, what you would want artists or just the general public or people to know more about mathematics as a field and the applied use of it.
Whoa. Okay, so let me take the interest in art. I've always been interested in art. I think art is I mean, I've always been exposed to art and always been fascinated by art, and I think art is great because it gives us, just like for me, mathematics gives me a way of thinking analytically and a tool to articulate and to understand logical stuff. Art is something that gives you shortcuts, ways on the emotional plane. I mean, it resonates. I mean, that's how I experience art. And so it's important to me. And that's completely independent of whether I can use mathematics for it. I think mathematics is the tool we have, is the way we have invented to make these intellectual shortcuts to reason about things. I think it started as early as people realizing that 2 oranges and 2 apples and 2 giraffes share a 2-ness, and started naming that. I mean, in mathematics, you do a lot of naming. You say, you name things because there's a structure there that you know you're going to want to talk about again and you're going to meet again. And so you name it and you start realizing its properties, and so you encapsulate them with that name. And so you then start to reason about them. And so you build these, you familiarize yourself with certain links and shortcuts and so on, because then you can use them as a unit to use them elsewhere. So that's what mathematics is, recognizing these patterns and reasonings in patterns and building blocks and assembling them. And then you can apply them in many, many places. So that's, I think, why mathematics is so useful in so many different ways of studying things, because it's the language, the tool we invented to do that. And so many people, I think, use mathematical reasonings even if they don't realize they're using mathematics. That brings us to the question of making sure mathematics reaches people widely, and and people kind of sometimes mistrust it or don't like it. And so I think that's a huge challenge in trying to be much better at teaching mathematics. I mean, we certainly have seemed to really develop a way of teaching mathematics that turns many people off, and that's not very efficient. And it's a shame. I mean, and I think I'm very happy that the mathematical community is now taking much more conscience of its responsibility in that respect than it did 1 or 2 generations ago. I mean, professional mathematical community. Have I covered most? Oh, challenges. Okay, well, there always are problems to be solved. I mean, the challenges is what you want to then, I mean, you say, how could I even do this? There are many problems I could list now where I have no idea of how to even start them. But when you see a little corner, you look at it and it's like a label on a pot, and there's a corner, and you start teasing at it, and if you can peel it off, and you get to things. And so the challenges are what provides me my livelihood. I mean, so that's what I work on. Okay.
Okay, so let's thank Ingrid.